If you've ever wanted to make the sound of an old crystal radio for your next science fiction score, crank up the resonance all the way and move the cutoff all around. Actually, while we're here, we probably should discuss resonance. Resonance is the parameter that emphasizes the frequencies right around that cutoff point and normally gives you kind of a metallic, spacey kind of sound. You can decide how steep that slope of the filter is by selecting the slope button, either 12 dB per octave or 24. Now, we're back to envelopes, only these ones on the filter and the amp are 4-stage ones. A, D, S, R. They stand for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now, just like in the oscillator common section, we need to crank up the envelope depth or nothing we do here will make any difference at all. So let's take all the sliders down to their minimum and select low pass filter here and bring the cutoff down very low. We're going to basically hear nothing. Now, if we adjust the attack, then the filter will open up at the rate we select on the slider. If we want a little decay, then we can crank up the decay, but this will always be really short-lived if the sustain level is set at nothing. Because what happens is that the filter opens up and then closes back down at the level that is set by the sustain slider here. This is the setting of the filter in this example when we're in the sustain portion of this envelope, basically the portion while I am leaning on the keys here. If that's set to nothing, then basically the filter in this case will be clamped all the way down. If I bring that up, then it will open up that filter while I'm holding this down. If I lift up, the filter closes straight back down. The fourth setting in this envelope is the release. Now, if I was to give that a little bit longer of a release, then you'll notice that the filter will open up and then slowly close back down. You can have that very long if you like, or very short. It will be a kind of a gate-like effect. Now you'll notice that both the filter and the amp have very similar ADSRs or envelopes, and they both change, in the filter's case, the timbre over time, and in the amp, the amplitude over time. The next knob that changes the filter setting is the key follow. If you set this knob to the right, then the filter's cutoff will rise the further up the keyboard you go. If you go to the left, then the higher you go on the keyboard, the lower the cutoff will be. This is handy if you ever have a synth sound that kind of takes off as you go up into the higher keys. In other words, it becomes a little too harsh or trebly as you play some of these higher keys. If you select a low pass filter and set the key follow all the way to the negative on the left hand side there, then what will happen is that as you go up here on the keyboard, the tracking will follow here in a negative fashion and close up that filter and restrict some of those high frequencies. That'll really help for some of those lead sounds that get a little bit too trebly or harsh up in the top end. Now, the next knob here requires a little bit of explanation, and it refers to the term LFO, which stands for low frequency oscillator. Now, low frequency oscillators are a form of oscillators, but instead of them making sound, they modulate sound. While the oscillators 1 and 2 cycle so fast, and thousands of times per second, they actually make sound, a low frequency oscillator, on the other hand, maybe only moves at a few cycles per second. This is useful for modulating the pitch, tone, or volume of your JP8000 in the same way that maybe a bad opera singer might modulate her pitch, tone, or volume. You sometimes call this tremolo or vibrato. Now, you'll notice that there's an LFO1 depth knob in oscillator common, in the filter section, and also the amp section. And it's those trusty knobs that have a center detent, meaning no effect of this LFO in this particular section, or you can give it either a positive modulation or a negative modulation. So as you could imagine from here, we can have LFO affecting these three sections in differing independent amounts. Of course, if we use the LFO in the oscillator common section, we can change things like the pitch or the cross modulation depth. In the filter, we can modulate the timbral features of that particular sound, or in the amp, we can modulate the amplitude or the volume of that sound. You can also adjust the shape of the LFO from triangle to sawtooth to square to sample and hold, which kind of gives you random values or random modulation. You can also adjust the rate of the LFO and also how long it takes to get up to that modulation by using the fade knob here. By the way, the LFOs are syncable to MIDI clock, so you can get some really interesting setups that way. Now, we've gone through a fairly heavy dose of Synthesis 101 here, and I hope you're still with me. Bear with us because we're just about done, and we'll go through what I think is probably the most intuitive portion, and that is the amp section. Let's start with the easy one. The level knob here is just a programmable volume. You turn it up or down, and whenever you write the patch, that setting gets saved along with it. Now let's look at our trusty ADSR here, or our envelope, 4-stage envelope, and we'll decide how loud the sound will be while it's sustaining, our sustain level here. In other words, what is the level of the sound while I am leaning on the keys? This will be different depending on what sound we're going after. Say for example, if I was to bring up an organ sound, now that will just play forever. I mean, if I laid a ham sandwich on here and came back a year later, provided someone was paying these electric bills, the sound would still be playing. Where if I brought up, say, a plucked sound, like say this guy, what happens is that it plays and decays away. It never actually gets to the sustain portion. Let's get back to our template sound, B88, and we'll look at the other stages of the envelope. Now, if the attack is set to its lowest point, the sound will start straight away. As soon as we hit that key, the sound starts. If we raise that slider, the sound will have a slower attack. Now, the next stage, decay, adjusts how long it takes to get down to the sustain level. So let's get a good handle on this by turning the sustain level to nothing. That way we can hear the attack and decay really easily. So we'll bring them up about midway. You can hear the attack, and then it dies away. So once we have the attack and the decay down, we then decide whether we want a sound that is going to sustain while we hold the keys down. Is it going to be an organ sound, or is it going to be kind of a pluck sound that just attacks and just decays away? The final setting, release, allows us to decide whether we want an abrupt sound, like that, or something with a longer release. And finally, the remaining knob here allows you to use LFO1 to modulate volume. Or if you select it again, your LFO modulates pan. Or finally, if you select it again and the selection key glows red, the knob just becomes your plain old pan setting from left to the right. So what have we learnt? That's a lot of information that we've rammed down your throat in a relatively short period of time, but even if you only use just a small portion of it, I'm telling you, it is really, really useful. Truth is, for a number of years I used to work on concert tours programming synths, and more often than not, I would not be building patches from scratch. Quite often the artist would come up to me and say, well, I like this sound, but it needs to have a different attack or a release on it, or maybe we need to fatten enough of it. With that in mind, let's go over a crash course of the tweaks you'll perform most often. Let's start with A65 polysync here, and to find out kind of what's making up this sound, let's check out the oscillator balance. There's oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. We have a super saw on oscillator 1 and a square wave on oscillator 2. Let's isolate oscillator 2. So maybe we'll make it a little bit thinner there and go back to our first oscillator here and make it a little fatter. We could adjust the filter cutoff. And finally we could change the envelope here to give us kind of a totally new sound. Adjust the envelope depth. To come up with a totally new sound. Now if it's a sound that you want to keep, you can save it to user memory. Just hit Write and select which patch you want to store it to. Now if you want to rename it, just hit Name and use the up and down keys to change the letter here. If you want to advance through the name, just hit Name again to advance the cursor. Finally hit Write again and you're done. By the way, don't worry about losing that patch you just wrote into, because when the JP8000 comes out of the box, the user patches are nothing more than a copy of the preset patches. You'd actually be a pretty busy programmer if you came up with 128 new patches. Now, apart from the parameters that have dedicated knobs and sliders on the front panel of the JP8000, there are others that are lurking beneath the 8 keys here that normally select the patches and performances. Hold Shift and any one of these 8 buttons that line up below the screen, and you'll get into a number of screens that pertain to the parameters that are listed in black here. Once you've got into this mode, you can then hit any one of these keys and cycle through the various screens that are available. Once you select a parameter, you can use the up and down buttons to change the settings. There are settings for performance, each of the 2 parts, MIDI settings, and so on. Actually, while we're here, I should mention that if you are editing any parameter on the JP8000 that has its own knob or slider, you can hold down Shift and you can see that precise parameter being changed. In fact, if you want to precisely fine-tune the adjustments of these parameters, you can use the up and down buttons while you have the Shift key depressed. Oh, and by the way, if you hold down Shift and 7, initialize utilities button, and press it down until we get to temporary scope. Now, temporary scope is a view of the exact value of any knob. If you select temporary scope here and move any particular slider, you can see that the screen shows me its exact value. I'm not able to change its value by moving the slider. I can just see that particular value of that knob or slider. Actually, I can change it if I use the up and down buttons, but primarily this function is useful for seeing the exact value of any knob or slider. The reason being this: when I change from patch to patch, all of the settings of these knobs and sliders change kind of underneath the hood. Now, they're not motorized with little servos that spin and slide these sliders to their correct settings. So when I select a new patch, I really have no idea what these settings are of any of these particular sliders. With temporary scope, I do. And finally, if you want to start a patch from scratch, you can hold down Exit and Write together, and all internal values of all of the parameters will be set to the existing settings of the physical front panel. The last thing to go over in the bottom right hand corner here, we have the effects. We have some tone settings and some effects. Bass and treble, also chorus to give us a bit of a fatter sound, and finally delay with time, feedback, and level. Now, the thing is, with chorus level and time and a lot of the other these things like, say, LFOs, they can all be synced to either an external MIDI clock or to the tempo knob here. So sometimes when you turn these knobs and nothing seems to be happening, it might be because they're synced to either the external MIDI clock or to the tempo knob. We'll get into this a little bit later on in the tape when we get into the